of legal professionals and other professionals. It's not going to be a presentation that's solely a legal analysis. The topic of ship recycling is complicated, to say the least, both the industry and the way it's legally regulated. So I'll be giving quite a lot of attention to introducing the topic, the industry and the legal landscape. And the second main part is legal analysis. I don't know how much time I'll have for the way forward or the final considerations, but we'll see as we go, since I lost a bit of time on the screen share here. So first off, here you have a flowchart of the transactions and cash flows in ship recycling. It's not that important, but just to give you an overview, there is a ship owner who has a ship, an end-of-life ship that they want to recycle. They sell this to a cash buyer intermediary that is a special purpose company that specialize in buying end-of-life ships and selling them to recycling yards. And that is, yeah, in short, how ship recycling is done transactional-wise. There's many benefits to using a cash buyer. Like, as you can see, there's towing costs, ship storage costs, pre-cleaning costs that are shifted from the ship owner to the cash buyer intermediary by using a cash buyer. Also, it makes using a cash buyer increases the distance for the ship owner of legal liability to which ship recycling yard the ship ends up on, and that's another or an issue of cash buyer use. It's good to know, but not something that we'll go deeply into here. Ship recycling statistics is the next thing to address. Ship recycling is a big industry. It's a global industry, and ship recycling totaled 8.9 million gross tonnage of recycled ships in 2018. Of these 18.9 million, 89.9% got beached. That equals 17 million gross tonnage of ships got beached in 2018. And beaching is a method of ship recycling that mainly occurs on the beaches of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. There is no easily understandable definition of the word beaching or the process, but Norwegian Ship Owners Association has defined it as recycling of ships without using fixed installations for collection and handling of dangerous and polluting wastes. That is a good definition, but it still doesn't say too much. But that picture in the background says a lot. It shows how it's done. What's basically done is that the ships are sailed up on beaches with big tidal mudflats. They lie in the intertidal zones as they're broken apart on the beach manually by workers, as you can see here. This is a process that releases a lot of materials into the environment. It's very dangerous for the workers as well. There's many hazardous materials in ships. Here's a list of some of them. I won't go detailed into this, but as you can see, there's lead, mercury, asbestosis, PCBs, etc. When they lie in this intertidal zone, many of these materials are washed out into the sea again. Some sink into the ground, into the sediment, and here we have a table that with an estimation of accumulated hazardous wastes on the beaches of Bangladesh and Pakistan between 2010 and 2030. And as you can see, it's quite a lot of hazardous materials that accumulate in the beach. This is not just a problem on the beach, but it's also a problem considering the rising sea levels, as the rising sea levels take a lot of these from being rather sediments, as they are right now, and immovable, and wash them out into the water and into the eco-marine system. And what happens there is naturally that these hazardous materials, they make their way into the marine environment in the same way as microplastics, basically, and poisons the environment, poisons the groundwater. It's also dangerous for the people living around. There is a quite prominent conflict of interests for the countries where ship recycling and beaching occurs. On one side, it's an industry that employs a lot of people. In 2019, it was estimated that 225,000 people worked directly in ship recycling or in ancillary operations. Ship recycling provide a lot of steel for the domestic industries. Like in Bangladesh, it provides 80 to 90% of the steel supply for the country. It also has an aspect of circular economy because when a ship is recycled, a lot of the materials are actually recycled. It has a recycling percentage between 95 to 98%. So when, and on average, 1.9 ton of carbon is emitted per ton of steel produced, it is, as a recycling industry, a very effective one. Also, it's a big economic contributor to the countries in taxes. Like in Pakistan, the industry contribute with between 25 million to 60 million euros in taxes annually. And that's just in one of these three recycling countries. On the other hand here, on the right hand, we see the more unfortunate and darker sides of ship recycling. It has been called, being a shipbreaker has been called the most dangerous occupation globally by the International Labour Organization, and is quite often referred to as one of the most dangerous. It has caused 400 deaths since 2009, directly at the yards. That is not counting everyone who's died from the poisoning and further out effects. It's asbestosis in work is 20 years shortest life expectancy for a shipbreaker. A lot of child labor is part of the workforce. And as already mentioned, it causes significant pollution of the marine environment in the vicinity of the beaching areas. So the conflict of interest for the countries which hold a big part of the ship recycling industry, it's difficult for them. And that's also part of why it's tricky to regulate as a global industry, because where the countries that have the ship recycling yards, they have different interests than the countries that have the big fleets. Or like the EU, who has 20% of the world fleet in flags, 40% in beneficial ownership. We have different interests than they do there, and it's tricky. And that's when we come to the legal matrix regulating the ship recycling industry. To put it simply, or attempt, we can say that there's two different sets of legislation that regulate this industry. You have the waste shipment legislation and the ship recycling legislation. The waste shipment legislation, the first here, is the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous wastes and their disposal. This convention was made in 1989 as a response to the toxic trade that followed the increased environmental awareness and pollution awareness in the West. Because when the Western countries gained environmental awareness, they started a trade of sending their toxic and hazardous waste to third countries. This is called the toxic trade that prompted the creation of the Basel Convention, trying to control this transboundary movement. That is the essence of it. So, and this is currently implemented in the EU through a regulation that we'll just call the Waste Shipment Regulation, EVSR. So those are the waste shipment legislations. But as you've already learned about industry, it's still a very dirty industry. So in 2009, the International Maritime Organization created a convention that's called the Hong Kong Convention for the Safe and Environmentally Sound Ship Recycling, or recycling of ships. As an IMO convention and not a UN convention as the Basel Convention is, the EU cannot be party to the Hong Kong Convention directly, as it is to the Basel. But the EU has still created a regulation, or that is its own version of the Hong Kong Convention, in an attempt to facilitate the ratification of the Hong Kong Convention. The Hong Kong Convention is not yet in force, but it's likely to enter into force in a not too distant future. As we are looking at this from an EU perspective, we are looking at how is the EU bound by their own regulations and international conventions. And that means that the Vienna Convention on the law of treaties is relevant. Now, the EU is not party to the Vienna Convention directly, but the EU has recognized that the principles of customary international law, including this one here, the Pacta sunt servanda, applies for the EU. That means that the EU is bound by the Basel Convention. It's binding upon the EU and must be performed in good faith. As we can see here, I've tried to make a figure to make the legal structure a bit more understandable. The Basel Convention has almost every country in the world is party to the Basel Convention, so it's a global structure in force, and it has been implemented in the EU here through the VSR and in other countries. While the Hong Kong Convention, this other structure of ship recycling regulations or legislations, is here. We won't concern ourselves very much with the Hong Kong Convention. We will look more at the ESRR and the relation between the Basel Convention and the ESRR. Now, when the ESRR was created by the EU, there was controversy regarding it because the ESRR shifted a part, or it shifted ships that were bigger than 500 gross tonnage from the scope of the EVSR, the Basel implementation, to the ESRR. That was controversial as it was done, but it's even more so now because of changes in the Basel Convention and developments here. And that is where we come to the real core of my master thesis, or the most pertinent problem. That is the accession of the Basel Ban Amendment. That's the development that has happened since and made the ESRR system problematic. The Basel Ban Amendment entered into force on the 5th of December of 2019. I've written it here, but there's a lot of Annex number 7 and Annex number 4, so I'll just translate what this means to make it more understandable. What it says is that each party listed in Annex 7, that means OECD countries, EU and Liechtenstein. We'll just call them OECD plus for sake of simplicity. OECD countries shall prohibit all transboundary movements of hazardous wastes, which are destined for, and then there's another reference to an annex. In this annex, that includes recycling operations. So 2 states that are not OECD plus members. So OECD plus states shall prohibit transboundary movement of hazardous wastes destined for recycling or included recycling to non-OECD countries. That is the essence of the Basel Ban Amendment. And all of this applies to ships because, as already shown, ships are hazardous wastes. That's a question I decided not to go too deep into here because of the time frame. But anywho, ships cannot be sent from OECD plus countries to non-OECD plus countries for recycling reasons on basis of the ban amendment. This is in contrast to the ESRR, which, as mentioned, took over for the ships for the sake of EU. According to the ESRR, ships can be recycled in third countries if they meet the criteria of Article 15 conferred with Article 13. There is no reservation for ESR in the ESRR for OECD countries or not. So basically, what we have is international or public international law, Basel ban amendment, that says you cannot export from OECD countries to non-OECD countries. And then we have the ESRR that says, yes, you can. For ships, you can, if you meet a certain set of criteria. And that's the question here, is that legal? That is the analysis that I've conducted. As a starting point, the Basel Article 26 says that no reservations or exceptions may be made to this convention. That is the baseline. So as a starting point, it doesn't seem as if it can be done. However, there is an article that allows for deviating structures or structures that deviate from the Basel system. And that is Article 11. I won't read the entire thing, but it has four criteria. The first is that the deviating structure comes from an agreement or arrangement. That this agreement must be regarding transboundary movement. It is valid insofar as it's that it does not derogate from the environmentally sound management of hazardous wastes, and the provisions must not be less environmentally sound than what is provided for by the Basel Convention. Now, as all of these criteria must be met for a valid Article 11 arrangement to be present, we don't need to look at all for the sake of this presentation. So we'll only focus on one criterion, and that is the one that says do not derogate. That agreement must not derogate from the rules on environmentally sound management. Now we are back to treaty interpretation and the Vienna Convention, because the Vienna Convention has the rules of treaty interpretation, and these also apply for the EU. And the first one is, the first principle of interpretation is that the Basel Convention is to be interpreted in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the term of the treaty in context of its light and its purpose. Secondly, any subsequent practice in the application of the treaty which establishes the agreement of the parties regarding the interpretation is to be taken into account. And lastly, the circumstances of the treaty's conclusion can be taken into account when the initial interpretation leaves the meaning ambiguous. So when we conduct an Article 11 analysis of the ESRR and the Basel ban amendment, we start by looking at the ordinary meaning of the terms, because it's clear that the ban amendment is a rule on environmentally sound management, as it is both quite literally management or the export of waste. The transboundary movement of waste is management of waste, and it's also the core of the Basel Convention as such. But the first thing we'll look at is the ordinary meaning of the term derogate. Derogate is defined in legal definitions as, first, partial repeal of a law, usually by a subsequent act that in some way diminishes its original intent or scope. Second legal definition is to enact something that is contrary to it. And the third definition is an exception from a rule of law. In other words, the Basel Ban Amendment must not be repealed, diminished, contradicted, or granted exception by any Article 11 agreement. If it does, then it's not an Article 11 agreement. As the ESRR actually do create an exception that heavily implies that it cannot be an Article 11 agreement. Now we'll also look briefly at subsequent practice and the meaning of that, because there is a subsequent practice that is relevant for the sake of Article 11. And that is a term used by the Conference of the Parties to the Basel Convention. And this term is equivalent level of control and enforcement. The parties to the convention have used this term to refer to Article 11 on several counts, on the 7th, COP 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. But they've never actually addressed what that means in relation to Article 11. They haven't said if it is an overarching assessment, if it replaces Article 11. There's no decision connected to its meaning. Therefore, it lacks the legal foundation to set aside the clear criterion of derogation. So it must therefore be understood as an overarching assessment. However, for the sake of the ESRR, there really is no point, in the first step at least, to look at equivalent level of control and enforcement, because the ESRR falls already on the clear criterion of Article 11. It does derogate from the Convention's ban amendment in every ordinary meaning of the term derogate, and it's therefore unable to fulfill the criteria of Article 11. And this is an understanding that has previously been shared by the EU as well. They deemed it, in the 90s, they looked into this question and they deemed it unacceptable from a legal point of view to apply Article 11 to the ban amendment if it should ever enter into force, as it now has. So that is my main conclusion, that Article 11 cannot be used to create any deviating structures that deviates from the ban amendment. However, as far as treaty law goes, that does not mean that that will be the situation forever. There is a conference of the parties to the Basel Convention coming up this summer, and they can change, they can make decisions regarding the interpretation of Article 11, regarding what it means or the role of this term equivalent level of control and enforcement. In my master thesis, I've done an assessment of that as well. We won't go into that now because, well, there's no time for that. But either way, they can allow for equivalency to replace derogation, or to allow that Article 11 applies also to the Basel Ban Amendment. That can be the reality, and then an assessment of Article 11 equivalency needs to be done. But on a final note, I want to point out what these legal developments have done for the recycling industry so far. Because the first picture we see here is the first picture I showed you earlier. This is standard beaching practice. But the Hong Kong Convention and the rules of Hong Kong Convention and the ESRR, which are focused on the technical requirements to ship recycling facilities and ships, have led to an improvement, because the ship recycling yards of, this is one from India, it's called Prayer Blue. It's the first one that received a so-called Hong Kong certificate of compliance. It, as you can see, it's a huge improvement from standard beaching, but it's still quite far from the ESRR standards. This, however, is quite close to the ESRR standards. This is pictures from another yard in India called YS Investments. They have not received ESRR acceptance by DNV-GL, which is the classification society that deals with that for the EU. But another very recognized classification society has said that these meet the ESRR standards, and that is Lloyd's Register. So there is a big improvement going on in the industry, prompted by the international regulations and the EU regulations on ship recycling. So it's not all dark, and hopefully the industry will continue to improve. And yes, there's a lot of interesting things in this topic, legally and about the industry. And if you should wish to read my thesis, you could either just message me or find it at Bora. I can send it to you, or you can find it there. I also have a lot of sources on the topic. If there's something in particular you'd like to know more about, don't hesitate to contact me. Yeah, thank you.